That morning, when I pushed open the heavy oak door of my workshop and saw what lay motionless on the floor, scattered across the pale yellow pine shavings, my legs nearly gave out beneath me. I had to grip the doorframe just to keep myself from collapsing right there. 45 years of working wood with these hands. 45 winters of snow piling up against the workshop walls in New England, and not once, in all those years, had I ever felt a cold like the one that crept slowly up my spine in that moment. If you're listening to this story right now, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. I truly want to know who's out there, sitting with me and listening in this moment. And please, stay with me until the very end, because what I'm about to tell you isn't just a story. It's something that still jolts me awake at 3 in the morning, even now, 2.5 years later, as my hair has turned grayer, and my hands no longer hold a chisel as steady as they once did. My name is Howard Lindquist. I'm 68 years old, spent 32 years working as an industrial pipefitter down in the Gulf of Mexico, mostly out of Houma, Louisiana, on the offshore rigs, before my niece sat me down at her kitchen table one Thanksgiving and told me, gently but firmly, that it was time to come home to Vermont. My wife Eleanor passed in the November of 2021, pancreatic cancer. The cruelest kind, the kind that moves like a freight train downhill. From the diagnosis to her last breath was barely 4 months. After she was gone, the only thing that stopped me from drinking myself into an early grave next to hers was the woodworking shop standing 50 yards behind our farmhouse. The one I'd built board by board with my own 2 hands the summer we moved up to that hilltop property in 1991. I think about that sometimes. How a building can be a kind of medicine, a church without a pulpit, a place where a grieving man can put his hands on something solid and remember he still exists. 80 acres of good Vermont hill country we had up there, a trout stream cutting across the back 40, a stand of black walnut trees my own grandfather had planted when he came back from the Korean War and bought that land off an old dairy family for almost nothing. Those walnut trees were my inheritance. I'd been letting a few of them grow tall and patient for years now, thinking that someday I'd mill them down myself and build something worth passing on. A dining table, maybe. A blanket chest. Something my daughter Rebecca could one day hand down to her own children when they were old enough to know the value of such a thing. Rebecca was my only child, 41 years old, married for 7 years to a man named Bradley Whitcomb, a man who worked in commercial real estate development down in Boston. And here I'll tell you the honest truth. I had never been entirely comfortable around my son-in-law, not from the first dinner I'd shared with him. He was the kind of man who always had an angle, always a new investment opportunity humming under his words, always something he wanted to pitch over Sunday dinner with that wide white smile of his. Eleanor had liked him well enough, or at least she'd tried to, for Rebecca's sake. Me, I held my tongue. A father doesn't have to love his daughter's husband, he only has to tolerate him, and keep one eye open. And friends, let me say this right here at the start. If you have a feeling in your gut about someone close to your family, someone whose stories don't quite add up, please don't ignore that feeling, because your gut knows things your head hasn't figured out yet. That Tuesday in late October was one of those gentle Vermont days when the maples were still holding on to their last red leaves. The sky was that washed-out cobalt blue you only get in autumn up in the Northeast Kingdom. I had driven into Montpelier that morning to pick up a brand new set of bench chisels at the old Aubuchon hardware store on Main Street. I'd been saving up for those chisels for the better part of a year. A proper Lie-Nielsen set forged up in Maine, the kind real woodworkers spend a lifetime dreaming of, cost me a little over $450 all told, and I was feeling good about myself for the first time in a long while. I had a hot coffee from the little diner on State Street, steaming up in the cup holder of my truck. I had pension money in my wallet, and for the first time since Eleanor's funeral, I was actually thinking about a project that might bring me a sliver of joy instead of just keeping my hands too busy to ache. I was standing at the register, friends, when I noticed the woman in line right in front of me. She was small, thin as a reed, maybe 80 years old, maybe older. She had a scarf tied under her chin in that old country way that my own mother used to wear when she was hanging laundry on the line back when I was a boy in the 1960s. The woman had a single can of dark walnut wood stain on the counter, a small package of fine grit sandpaper, and one solitary brass cabinet hinge. The young man behind the register was waiting patiently while she counted out coins from a worn leather change purse. Quarters, dimes, nickels, even a few pennies. Her hands were trembling slightly, the skin on them so thin you could see every blue vein. I watched her count that money out 3 separate times before she finally laid it down on the counter and looked up at the cashier with this look of quiet, awful dignity that absolutely broke my heart in two. "I'm $12 short," she whispered, so softly I could barely catch it. "I'll leave the hinge. I can come back for it next week when my Social Security comes in. And friends, I want you to listen to me carefully here." Something inside me moved before my brain even had time to catch up with it. I stepped forward, and I set my $400 set of chisels down right next to her tiny pile of supplies. "I'll get hers too, son," I said to the kid at the register. "Ring it all together, please." The old woman turned to look up at me, and I'm going to tell you something strange. The look on her face was not the look of a woman who was simply grateful. It was the look of a woman who was studying me. Reading me, maybe. Her eyes were the palest gray I have ever seen on a human being. Almost silver, like the color of frost on a window in February. And those eyes held mine for what felt like a long, long moment before she finally spoke. "You are a kind man," she said. "What is your name?" "Howard," I told her. "Howard Lindquist. From out on the old Worcester Road." "Lindquist," she repeated slowly, and she gave a small, deliberate nod, the way a person nods when something has just clicked into place. "I knew a Lindquist once, a long time ago." You know, I want to pause my own story for just a second here, because I think this is one of those moments worth sitting with. I think most of us, in our normal busy American lives, would have just paid for the chisels, taken our bag, and walked out into the parking lot without giving that old woman a second glance. We're all so rushed, aren't we? Always somewhere to be. Always our phones buzzing in our pockets. And honestly, I think if it had been any other day, I might have done exactly that. But for whatever reason, maybe because Eleanor had just been on my mind that morning, maybe because the Lord had his hand on my shoulder in some way I'll never fully understand, I stopped. I noticed her. And that one small choice, friends, that one tiny act of stopping for a stranger, changed every single thing that came after. So if you're listening tonight, and you're wondering whether the small kind thing you did at the gas station or the grocery store yesterday actually mattered, I'm here to tell you it might have mattered more than you'll ever know. Anyway, the old woman let me pay for her things. She gathered up her little brown paper bag of supplies, and she walked with me out into the chilly parking lot. And I remember being honestly surprised at how steady her step was for a woman who had looked so frail at the counter. When we reached my old gray Ford F-250 truck, she reached out and she took hold of my forearm. Her grip was much stronger than it had any right to be. She looked up at me, and those pale silver eyes had gone sharp now, sharp as the edge of a freshly stropped chisel. "Howard," she said, and her voice had dropped low, lower, urgent now. "Listen to me very carefully. When your daughter's husband comes to your workshop this week, and he will come before this week is out, you will let him take whatever he asks for. You will not argue with him. You will not question him. You will not raise your voice. But after he leaves, after his truck has gone back down your driveway and out onto the main road, do not sweep the wood shavings off your workshop floor. Not that night. Not until the sun comes up the next morning. Do you understand what I am telling you?" I just stared down at her. I'll be honest with you, friends. For a few seconds, I genuinely thought she must be one of those poor old souls whose minds had started to wander into the fog the way some folks do at that age. But her eyes were not foggy. They were clearer than mine, I'd wager. And they were locked onto me like a vice. "Ma'am," I said carefully, "I appreciate what you're saying, but I have to tell you. My son-in-law hasn't been up to my place in months. He doesn't have much use for an old man's wood shop, and he's a busy man with his real estate work." She squeezed my arm even harder, hard enough that her bony fingers actually hurt me through my flannel sleeve. "He will come before the week is out. You mark my words, Howard Lindquist, and when he is gone, do not touch those wood shavings until the sun rises. Promise me." Then she let go of my arm. She nodded once. And she walked away across the parking lot toward an old beige Buick Regal, the kind they don't even make anymore. I just stood there in the cold October air with my paper bag of chisels in my hand, watching her drive away, and I felt the strangest sensation crawling up the back of my neck. like somebody had just walked across my grave. You know that feeling? The one your grandmother used to call a goose walking over your tomb. That's exactly what it was. I drove home that afternoon in something of a daze. And honestly, by the time I'd unloaded my groceries and put the kettle on for tea, I'd already started telling myself the old woman had been confused, mistaken me for someone else. Lindquist isn't an uncommon name up here in northern New England. Half the families in Vermont came over from Sweden and Norway in the last century. I unloaded my chisels in the workshop. I put a pot of beef stew on the stove for supper. I watched the Bruins game that night with a cold beer in my hand and my old border collie whiskey curled up by my feet. I did not think about the old woman in the kerchief again. Not once. Not until Thursday. And here's where I want to stop and ask you something real quick. If you were me, if a perfect stranger had grabbed your arm in a parking lot and given you a warning that bizarre, would you have actually listened? Would you have remembered? Or would you have shrugged it off the way I almost did? Honestly, I think most of us would have laughed it off by Thursday morning. I know I almost did. And that's the part that still humbles me when I think back on it. Thursday afternoon, around 3 o'clock, I heard a truck coming up my long gravel driveway. Not the mailman whose little Jeep I knew by sound. This was something heavier, a diesel engine. I looked out through my kitchen window. And my heart, friends. My heart sank straight down into my work boots. Because pulling up right alongside my workshop was Bradley's big jet black Dodge Ram 3500, the brand new one with the chrome grille and the long flatbed trailer hitched up behind it. And Bradley was already swinging down out of the cab, along with another fellow I had never laid eyes on before in my life. A heavy-set man in a black hooded sweatshirt pulled all the way up over his head, even though the afternoon wasn't cold enough to warrant it. I walked out the back door to meet them, wiping my hands on a shop towel. Bradley greeted me with that wide salesman's grin he always wore. "Howard, hey, tried to call you about 10 times this morning. Your phone must have been off again." "My phone's been on, Bradley," I said, my voice flatter than I meant it. "But go on. What brings you all the way up here on a Thursday?" Bradley glanced sideways at the other fellow, and then back at me. "Listen, Howard, I've got a bit of a situation. Buddy of mine down in the Back Bay is building a custom mountain home up in Stowe, and his architect is looking for some real high-end reclaimed black walnut, live-edge slabs, the really fancy stuff. I told him about that stand of trees you've got out behind your creek, and he's willing to pay top dollar. Was thinking, since I was already up this way for a property showing in Waterbury, I'd grab a couple of logs for him today, if that's all right with you. And friends, I felt the old woman's words drop down the back of my neck like a chip of ice. You will let him take whatever he asks for. You will not argue with him. How much is he paying for them? I asked, just to see what Bradley would do. Bradley waved his hand in the air dismissively. We're still working out the numbers. I'll cut you in fairly, don't you worry about that for a second. Right now, I just want to grab him a sample, so he can see the quality and the grain pattern. A sample. The man had a 30-foot flatbed trailer behind his truck and a stranger in a hooded sweatshirt to help him load it. And he was calling that a sample. But I just nodded slowly. I told him the chainsaw was hanging on its hook by the side door. I told him the ratchet straps were in the blue plastic bin under the workbench. And I told him to mind the electric fence at the bottom pasture, because the heifers had been let out that week. Bradley gave me one of those quick man hugs. The kind a fellow gives when he's relieved he didn't have to fight for something he wanted. And then he and the hooded fellow climbed back into the truck and drove down the back tractor track toward my walnut grove. I went into my workshop. I tried to look busy at the bench, sanding a bookshelf I'd been putting together for the local library, but really I was listening with both ears. The chainsaw started up about 20 minutes later. I heard it run for a long, long time. Way too long for a sample. And when they finally came back past the farmhouse 2 hours later, that flatbed was loaded down with 3 enormous walnut logs, each one as thick as a grown man's torso, and probably worth more than that brand new Dodge Ram of his. Bradley waved at me from the cab window as they passed. I waved back, my jaw tight. Then he did something strange. He pulled the truck up right alongside my workshop, and he and his hooded buddy both climbed out. "Howard, mind if we grab a quick bite from your fridge before we head back? Long drive down to the city ahead of us." "Help yourself," I said. "There's leftover stew on the stove from last night." While they were both inside my kitchen, I stood in the open doorway of my workshop, and I watched them through the kitchen window from across the yard. And friends, this is the part I want you to pay close attention to. I saw Bradley open my refrigerator. I saw him take out the pot of stew. I saw him hand it over to his buddy, but Bradley himself did not eat. Bradley walked down my hallway toward the spare back room where I kept my old steel filing cabinet. The one with all of Eleanor's medical papers, my last will and testament, the deed to the property, our bank statements going back 20 years. He was in that back room for at least 4 full minutes. Then he came back out to the kitchen, ate a quick small bowl of stew, and the two of them left in a hurry. I stood there watching his red taillights disappear back down my driveway. The autumn sun was sinking low behind the green mountains, and the shadows were stretching long and black across my dirt yard. I went into the spare room. I checked the filing cabinet. Nothing seemed obviously out of place, but something felt wrong. Something deep in the marrow of my old bones felt terribly, terribly wrong. And then I remembered her, the old woman in the kerchief. Do not sweep the wood shavings. I walked back out to the workshop, and I flipped on the long fluorescent overhead lights. The whole floor was covered in a fresh layer of fine pine and oak shavings from my afternoon's work. Mine. And, I now realized with a slow, icy feeling, whatever Bradley had been doing in there too, while his hooded friend was distracting me with the leftover stew. I hadn't even noticed Bradley slip into the workshop. I stood there in the doorway looking at that floor, and I scanned every inch of it carefully. At first I saw nothing out of the ordinary, just my workbench, my tools hanging on their pegboard, the half-finished bookshelf, a small pile of offcuts in the corner, the shavings on the floor, undisturbed by my own boots, because I had stayed right at the threshold. I wanted so badly to grab the broom, friends. 45 years of habit. A clean shop is a safe shop, my own father had always said. But the old woman's voice was right there in my ear, plain as a church bell, so I turned off the lights. I locked the heavy oak door, and I walked back to the farmhouse on legs that felt suddenly very old. I did not sleep one wink that night. Whiskey lay at the foot of my bed, and I just stared up at the dark ceiling and listened to the wind coming down off Camel's Hump, and I tried with everything I had to understand what I was feeling. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up on sleep entirely. I got up. I made myself a strong cup of black coffee. I sat at the kitchen table watching the slow red numbers crawl across the face of the wall clock. And friends, I'll tell you, I have not felt that kind of dread since the night the company chaplain came aboard the rig in the Gulf to tell us about my older brother's heart attack back in 1998. It was that kind of waiting. That kind of knowing without knowing. When the first thin gray light finally crept up over the eastern ridgeline, I pulled on my insulated work boots and my heavy canvas Carhartt parka, and I walked out across the frosted yard with a flashlight clenched in my hand. I opened the workshop door slowly, carefully, like a man defusing a bomb. I stepped inside, and I shone that beam down at the floor, and there, pressed clear as day into the fresh shavings, were footprints, 2 distinct sets of them. One set was Bradley's work boots. I could tell by the deep vibram sole pattern. The other set was smaller, narrower, a running shoe of some kind. The footprints led from the side door, around behind my workbench, and over to the far corner where I kept an old steamer trunk that had once belonged to my grandfather Eric. The trunk had been pulled a few inches out from the wall. I could see the perfectly clean rectangle on the dusty concrete where it had sat undisturbed for the better part of 15 years. And friends, I want you to imagine yourself standing where I was standing right at this moment. Imagine your hands shaking as you reach down. Imagine the way the cold concrete feels through the knees of your work pants when you kneel down. Imagine the way your heart is hammering against your ribs so loud you can hear it in your own ears. I opened that trunk with hands that would not stop trembling. Inside, beneath the old wool horse blankets my grandfather had kept folded in there since before I was born, was a black canvas duffel bag I had never, ever seen before in my entire life. I unzipped it slowly, and inside that duffel bag, friends, were 4 bricks of what looked to me like compressed white powder. Each brick was wrapped tightly in clear plastic and silver duct tape, and along with those bricks was a digital scale, a box of small Ziploc baggies, and a thick manila envelope absolutely stuffed full of crisp American $100 bills. At a quick guess, maybe $25,000 cash. I sat down right there on the cold concrete floor of my own workshop. I put my head in my hands, and I understood everything. Every single thing. Bradley was going to call the state police. Or worse, he was going to wait a few weeks and then go to Rebecca with a story. A story about how her father had been keeping terrible secrets out at the farm, how the old man's mind was finally slipping the way Eleanor had warned, how I needed to be declared mentally incompetent and put away in a memory care facility for my own safety. Either way, the land was going to end up in his hands. 80 acres of prime Vermont hill country, worth somewhere close to $2.5 million now, with the new development corridor pushing north out of Montpelier. The black walnut stand alone was worth a small fortune, and he had already started stripping it. But the real prize, the trophy, was the land itself, and the easiest way to get it was to have the old man either locked up in a prison or locked up in a home. And friends, I'll tell you, if I had been a younger man, my first instinct would have been to grab my deer rifle from the gun cabinet and go drive down to Boston that very morning. But I'd had enough of violence in my life, and I knew, deep down, that the only way to win this kind of fight was with patience and paperwork. But here was the miracle. I had not swept the floor. The footprints were there, his and the other man's. The trunk had been moved. And friends, listen to this, because this is the piece that saved my life. A man who is secretly hiding his own drug stash on an old man's property would never, ever bring along a stranger to help him do it. That would be insanity. A man hides his own stash alone, in secret, with nobody else as a witness. The two sets of footprints proved that he had not been hiding. He had been planting. I took out my old flip phone, and I photographed everything from every angle. The footprints, the duffel bag, the contents of the bag, the old trunk. I took close-up pictures of the fresh saw marks where Bradley had cut my grandfather's walnut trees. The way the cuts were jagged and hasty, the way a man cuts when he doesn't actually own the wood and doesn't care about preserving it. Then I went back into the spare room and I checked that filing cabinet again, very, very carefully this time. And I found what I had missed in the dim light the night before. My last will and testament. The one Eleanor and I had drawn up together with our family attorney back in 2017, had been replaced with a different document. Someone had taken the original right out of the folder and put a new one in its place. The new will left absolutely everything to Bradley and Rebecca jointly, and it specifically named Bradley as the sole executor and trustee of the entire estate. My own signature was forged on the bottom line, a reasonable forgery, but not a perfect one. The L in Lindquist had a little flourish I never use. I understood right then, sitting on the floor of that spare room, that this had been planned for a very long time. Months, at the very least. Maybe longer. He had been waiting like a hawk on a fence post for the right moment. He had waited until Eleanor was gone. He had waited until I was alone, isolated, deep in my grief. He had been patient, the way evil is always patient. You know, if you had told me a week earlier that my own son-in-law was capable of something like this, I would have called you a liar to your face. But that's the awful thing about evil, isn't it? It rarely arrives with horns and a pitchfork. It usually arrives with a firm handshake and a polished pair of dress shoes, and a story about an investment opportunity that's just too good to pass up. And friends, if you're listening to me tonight and you have a feeling that someone in your family is putting on a long-running show, please trust that feeling. Quietly, carefully, but trust it. I drove into Montpelier that morning. I did not go straight to the state police barracks, not yet. I drove first to my attorney, Gordon McAllister, an old friend I'd known since we were both running cross-country at Spalding High School back in the 1970s. Gordon had drawn up my original will. He took one slow look at the forged document spread across his desk, and he just shook his head, very slowly, his lips pressed thin. "Howard," he said quietly, "you go home. Sit tight. Say nothing to your daughter, nothing to anybody. Let me make a few phone calls." While I was waiting in his oak-paneled office, I found myself thinking about the old woman at the hardware store. Something was nagging at the very edge of my mind, the way a half-remembered tune does. I took out my phone, and I called Gordon's receptionist, Diane, and I asked her if she could quickly look up a name for me. Any Lindquists in the central Vermont area on older property records, going back to the 1960s or 1970s. She came back about 20 minutes later with a single name written on a slip of yellow legal pad paper. Astrid Lindquist Halverson, my grandfather Eric's younger sister. She had married a man named Paul Halverson and moved up to Hardwick, Vermont, way back in 1961. I had never met her, not once in all my life. My own father had had some terrible falling out with her over something to do with the old family homestead before I was even born, and the two branches of our family had never spoken a single word to each other again. I drove up to Hardwick that very afternoon. Took me close to 2 hours up Route 14, past Calais and the back roads through Walden. I found her in a tiny green shingled bungalow on the edge of town, with a small garden and a stone walkway. And when she opened her front door, those pale silver-gray eyes met mine, and she nodded the way a person nods when they have been waiting all day for someone to arrive. "Come in, Howard," she said softly. "I'll put the kettle on for tea." Over hot black tea at her kitchen table, with the late afternoon sun slanting through the lace curtains, Aunt Astrid told me her story. In 1976, her own son, a young man named Bjorn, had come home from working on the oil platforms down in Louisiana. He'd been gone almost 4 years, came back with a pretty young wife from somewhere in Texas and his head full of glittering schemes. Bjorn had convinced his parents, Astrid and Paul, to sign over their family farm to him for what he called tax planning purposes. Within 6 short months, Bjorn and his Texas wife had sold that land out from under them, left Astrid and Paul with absolutely nothing, and moved back south to Houston. Paul died of a massive heart attack the following winter, in a rented apartment above a hardware store in Street Johnsbury. Astrid had spent every single day of the last 49 years watching for the same evil to happen to somebody else. "I saw your son-in-law in the Aubuchon hardware store on Tuesday morning," she told me, her thin hands wrapped tight around her teacup, "about an hour before you walked in, Howard. He was buying a small bottle of rat poison, a roll of duct tape, and a bag of black plastic cable ties. A man does not buy those 3 things together for honest home repairs, Howard. A man buys those 3 things together for darker purposes." And when I overheard him asking the cashier whether anyone had seen old Howard Lindquist in town lately, whether the old man was still living alone out on the Worcester Road, well, I followed him out to the parking lot. I memorized the license plate of his Dodge truck, and I looked your name up in the county phone book that very afternoon. I had been planning to drive out to your farm Wednesday morning, regardless of the trouble it might cause an old woman my age. But then, there you were, standing right behind me in line, paying for my stain and my hinge with your own pension money. And I thought to myself, the good Lord has put this man in my path tonight for a reason, and that reason is that this time I get to stop it. She reached across that little oak kitchen table, and she took both my hands in both of hers. Her hands were as soft and as thin as old onion skin. I could not save my own husband, Howard. I could not save my own farm. I could not save my own son from himself. But by God in heaven, I could save yours. I could at least do that one thing. I sat at her kitchen table, and I cried. Friends, I just put my face down on my arm and I cried. The first real cry I had cried since the day we lowered Eleanor's casket into the cold November ground. You know, if you had told me when I walked into that hardware store on Tuesday that an 83-year-old great-aunt I had never even known existed was going to save my life and my land and my future grandchildren, I would have laughed in your face. But that's how the Lord works sometimes, isn't it? He sends his messengers in the form of little old ladies with $12 missing from their change purses. He doesn't send angels with flaming swords. He sends people. Ordinary, broken, beautiful people. And our job, friends, is just to be paying enough attention to recognize them when they cross our path. I drove down to the Vermont State Police Barracks in Berlin that very evening. I gave them the photographs. I gave them the duffel bag and its contents in a sealed paper grocery bag. I gave them the forged will. I gave them a written statement that took me close to 4 hours to type out on the detective's old computer. They told me to drive home, to act perfectly normal, to say absolutely nothing to Rebecca, to let them do their work. It took the state police and the DEA about 13 days. On the 14th day, they arrested Bradley Whitcomb in the parking lot of his Boston office tower at lunch hour. They found the rest of his operation in a rented storage unit out in Revere, Massachusetts. Cocaine, mostly, with some fentanyl mixed in, which is the part that still keeps me awake at 3 in the morning sometimes, because that is the poison that's killing our young people across this whole country, from the coal towns of West Virginia, to the small farms of Iowa, to the fishing villages of Maine, and to think it was passing through my own family. Bradley was charged with trafficking, possession with intent to distribute, forgery, fraud, identity theft, and attempted murder. The attempted murder charge came from a detailed plan they found saved on his laptop computer. A document in which he had laid out, step by step, his intention to slowly poison me with rat poison mixed into homemade casseroles he would deliver around the Thanksgiving and Christmas holidays. Make it look like a simple heart attack on a snowy December morning. His friend in the hooded sweatshirt, a man named Donovan Pruitt, was picked up 2 days later trying to cross into Quebec at the Highgate Springs port of entry. Rebecca came out to the farm the day after the arrest. She was absolutely wrecked. 28 weeks pregnant with her first child, my first grandchild, and her husband was now sitting in a county jail cell, and her whole life had collapsed in a single afternoon. She sat at my old pine kitchen table, and she sobbed in a way I had not heard her sob since she was 4 years old and had fallen off the playground swing at school. And I held her, friends. I held her the same way I had held her on that swing set day so many decades ago. And I told her, over and over, that everything was going to be all right, that she was going to come home and live with her old dad until the baby was born, and after, and as long as she needed. And that's exactly what she did. My grandson was born in late January of that year. We named him Henrik, after my own father. He's 2.5 years old now, bright-eyed, sharp-witted, with his mother's stubborn chin, and his great-grandmother Eleanor's quiet laugh. He toddles out to the workshop with me every single afternoon after his nap, and he sits on a tiny pine stool I built him, with his own name carved on the underside. And he watches me plane and joint the black walnut boards. I milled myself from those 3 logs the state police eventually returned to me after the trial was over. I am building him a blanket chest, friends. Hand-cut dovetails, brass hinges. I'm carving his name and his birth date into the lid in old-style script. Someday, when he's a man, I want him to open that chest and remember his grandfather. And remember that the wood came from trees his great-great-grandfather planted with his own hands 70 years ago. Rebecca filed for divorce while Bradley was awaiting trial. He took a plea deal in the end and won't be eligible for parole until Henrik is already in college. We don't talk about him much around the supper table. Some things you just have to leave behind in order to walk forward into the light. And friends, if you've ever had to leave a person you loved behind because they revealed themselves to be someone other than who they pretended to be, I want you to know it's okay to grieve that loss. It's a real loss. You're not just grieving the person. You're grieving the version of them you thought you knew. Aunt Astrid passed away last spring, peacefully, in her own bed up in Hardwick, with her cat sleeping curled up on her quilt. She left me a letter that Gordon McAllister hand-delivered to me at her funeral. In that letter, she wrote that holding little Henrik in her arms at her 90th birthday party in March was the happiest day of her life since the day her husband Paul had died 49 winters before. She wrote that the good Lord is slow, but he is never blind, and that sometimes he uses a little old woman with $12 missing from her change purse to answer a prayer that the other person didn't even know they were praying. I have thought about those words almost every single day for the last 2.5 years, friends. I have thought about how a small, unplanned act of kindness, a $46 bag of wood stain, and a single brass hinge, saved my land, my life, and the entire future of my only daughter and my only grandson. I have thought about how I almost did not say a single word to Astrid that morning at the hardware store. How I almost just paid for my own chisels and walked out into the cold autumn parking lot and minded my own business the way us old New Englanders are so often raised to do. How agonizingly close I came to losing absolutely everything that mattered to me in this world. Not because I had done something wrong, but because I almost did not do the small right thing. And friends, that thought right there is the one that humbles me down to my work boots every time I sit down at my morning coffee. So, here is what I want to say to you, friends, before I let you go tonight. Whatever state you are listening from, whatever country, whatever age you are, whatever heavy troubles you are carrying on your shoulders right now, please be kind to the stranger standing in line right in front of you. You don't know what they have been watching for. You don't know what they are quietly trying to warn you about. You don't know whose grandfather, whose daughter, whose unborn grandbaby might be saved tomorrow because you opened up your wallet today for $12 worth of nails and hinges. And I want to tell you something else. If anyone at all, ever grabs hold of your arm in a parking lot and whispers something strange to you, something about wood shavings or footprints, or the sound of a truck in your driveway, You listen to that person. You listen with both ears wide open. Because out here in these green Vermont hills, the wind comes down off the mountains carrying more than just the autumn cold. It carries warnings, if you know how to hear them. And the good Lord still uses ordinary people standing in ordinary lines at ordinary hardware stores to do absolutely extraordinary things in this world. And I want to share one piece of practical advice with you, my American friends, because this story isn't just a story, it's a warning that sits right in our own backyard. If you are over the age of 60 in this country, please update your last will and testament every single year and store it with a trusted attorney, not in a filing cabinet at home. Keep a copy in a bank safety deposit box. Most states, including Vermont, allow you to file an authenticated copy with the probate court for a small fee. If you suspect elder financial abuse, you can call the National Adult Protective Services Hotline or your local area agency on aging. There are also state-level elder fraud units. In Vermont, we have one operating right out of the Attorney General's office in Montpelier. The mistake most folks make is thinking that family members would never ever do this kind of thing. The truth is, the FBI reports that elder financial fraud costs American seniors close to $30 billion every single year, and the perpetrator is most often somebody in the immediate family. So lock your will down, watch your accounts, trust your gut, and if your gut is screaming at you about somebody close to you, believe it. This whole experience taught me that real evil never wears a costume. It wears a polite smile and brings you a six-pack of beer at Thanksgiving. The mistake most of us make is assuming that the people closest to us could never betray us. Ask yourself this honest question tonight, before you go to bed. Is there someone in your life whose stories don't quite line up? Whose generosity always seems to come with strings attached? Whose interest in your finances feels just a little bit too keen? If your answer is yes, please do something tomorrow. Call your attorney. Call your sister. Call somebody you trust. Don't wait. Don't be polite about it. Be brave for yourself, the way Aunt Astrid was brave for me. If you're listening tonight, and you're feeling alone the way I felt alone after Eleanor passed, I want you to know that loneliness is not a permanent condition. Help can arrive in the most unexpected forms, from the most unexpected people, at the most unexpected moments. If you're listening, and you've lost someone recently, and you're wondering whether the world still has any kindness left in it for an old grieving heart, I'm here to tell you it does. If you're listening, and you've got a bad feeling in your gut about somebody close to your family, please don't shrug it off the way I almost shrugged off Astrid's warning. If you're listening, and you've ever been the person who made the small act of kindness for a stranger, I want you to know it might have rippled out farther than you can possibly imagine. If you're listening, and you've ever been the stranger who received that kindness, pay it forward when your turn comes. If you're listening from a small town the way I am, where everyone knows your last name going back 3 generations, lean into that community. They are your safety net. And finally, if you're listening, and you have the chance to talk to your own elderly parent or grandparent this week, please do it. Tell them you love them. Look at their will. Look at their bank statements. Be the angel they didn't even know to pray for. Henrik is calling for me from the back porch right now, friends. I can hear his little voice through the screen door. He wants to come out and see what his grandpa Howard is building today. So I'm going to set down this phone now, and I'm going to go to him. And I'm going to lift him up onto his little carved pine stool. And I'm going to show him the way the morning sunlight catches the deep brown grain of the walnut wood, the way it glows almost copper-colored when you turn it just right. And I'm going to tell him, when he's old enough to understand, the story of an old woman with silver eyes who saved everything we have. So before I go, drop a comment for me down below. Comment number 1, if you think I did the right thing by listening to Aunt Astrid that day at the hardware store. Comment number 2, if you think Rebecca and her family deserve to be forgiven faster than I was ready to forgive. Comment number 3, if you have ever in your own life been in a situation like this one, where a stranger's small kindness or warning changed the entire course of your life. And right below that, please tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight? What city, what state, what country, and what time is it where you are sitting right now? I read every single comment that comes in, and I genuinely love hearing from listeners all across this beautiful country and around the world. Disclaimer, friends. This is a fictional story inspired by common real-life elder fraud cases reported across the United States. but it has been 100% rewritten by me here in Vermont to bring you something original and from the heart. If this story moved you tonight, please give the video a like, hit that subscribe button, and tap the little bell so you don't miss the next story I've got coming for you. May God bless you, may God keep you, and good night from the green hills of Vermont.